Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, and it is a great joy to have the opportunity to speak in this debate. An important debate. A debate which is important because of the scale of the issue, because of the individual suffering which people across the world experience, and because this is an issue which in many countries is actually sanctioned by the governments of those countries, and one which I believe demands a response from the government here in the United Kingdom. The scale of the issue has already been outlined very well by previous speakers. 200 million Christians under severe risk of persecution. Many thousands killed every year, and indeed ethnically cleansed from their homeland and from their towns. 50,000 Christians cleared from the city of Homs in Syria over the time of the civil war in that country. In Eritrea, people being imprisoned on a regular basis. And of course in Sudan, before it was partitioned, over a 30-year period, 2 million Christians killed by the regime. That's the scale of the problem. And it goes on even today. Within the last month, hundreds of people, whether from Nigeria to Eritrea to Kazakhstan, China, have been arrested, put in prison within the last month, but simply because of their faith. And when they go into prison, they're denied due process. They're denied access to lawyers. They're sometimes even denied knowledge of the charges which are being put against them. And they can languish in prison for a long, long time, and in horrible conditions. And a problem of that issue, had it been any other foreign problem, would have been a priority with the Foreign Office in this country. And yet, I've got to say, listening to the Minister in his opening speech today, and indeed the opposition front bench as well, there's been an attempt to try and widen this rather than zone in on the real issue, that here is a particular group of people who are being persecuted. And it's not just, of course, in Muslim countries. It's been pointed out that from Morocco right to Pakistan, Christians in Muslim countries are under threat. But it happens elsewhere. I will give way, yes.
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he will know, as I do, that in my parliamentary postbag of the persecution of Baha'is, particularly in Iran. But shouldn't the message come out, whether it's Baha'is or Christians, that a message has to come out from a plurality of voices, particularly because of the direction of the persecution, that actually persecution of people on the basis of their faith is actually a very un-Islamic thing to do?
Absolutely, and I think that is the point which we need to be making from this House today, that persecution from people of whatever faith and by whatever faiths is wrong. If we go beyond the Islamic countries, of course, and go to Korea, where 70,000 Christians languish in prison, some of them in most horrible conditions. And while I don't want to get into the lots of individual stories, one story which did strike me as in particular, because sometimes, and we found this in Northern Ireland over the time of the Troubles, people can get numbed by numbers. You know, they're just statistics, rather than thinking, what is the real suffering behind that? One prison, number 15 in Korea, North Korea, where 6,000 Christians are languishing, and on a regular basis they're brought out on a Sunday. 2 people are selected, paraded in front of the rest of their fellow Christians, stabbed with pointed bamboos, called upon to renounce their faith, and the torture will stop. And that's the kind of human individual suffering. And many of them, of course, finish up because they won't renounce their faith, finish up being murdered. And that's, leaving aside the huge numbers, that kind of horror, as the member for Gainsborough pointed out, when the Nazis carried that out in concentration camps, we pursued the prison guards and those who were responsible to the ends of the earth to prosecute them. and to make sure that we're brought to justice. And yet it seems that there is not that response when it comes to the persecution of Christians. Indeed, and it's not just government, of course, it's also the media. I thought it was particularly interesting when, just at the beginning of November, 80 Christians blown up as they worshipped in Pakistan, and BBC found it so important that it was listed below the Emmy Awards when it came to news reporting. And that seems to be the kind of seriousness which is attached to this kind of issue. One of the reasons why I believe that that is the response, of course, is because in many instances this persecution is actually sponsored, sanctioned and encouraged by governments in the countries concerned. We've already heard the Grand Mufti in Saudi Arabia calling for the destruction of all Christian churches on the peninsula. Human Rights Watch have said that the most dangerous place for a person to be a Christian today is in Pakistan, and that much of that persecution is sanctioned by the government. In Nigeria, a lot of the persecution of Christians there is fermented from official sources. And so it goes on around the world. And maybe that's the reason that when we point out and specify the persecution of Christians, then we are actually pointing the finger at governments that sometimes, maybe for political reasons, we need as allies. For commercial reasons, we need as trade partners, or whatever it happens to be. And if that is the reason why we're not prepared to be specific about this persecution, then I think it is a great shame on the government of our country. Yes, we'll give way.
Grateful again to the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I would say that although we have our concerns about persecution, perhaps one of the things we should be doing are highlighting good practice when it happens around the world. There are indeed Islamic countries that are tolerant countries, and maybe we should be holding up the examples of places like Senegal, Bangladesh, Turkey, places where there is a lot more tolerance than the societies perhaps we are concentrating on at the moment, and to show that there is the example of an Islamic state where we would all be quite happy to live in one way or the other.
I'm not so sure of the human rights issues in all of the countries that the member has mentioned.
More tolerant.
But what can be done and what should be done? And I think that the first thing is, and leaving aside, I know there's a debate about what the government should do, but I do believe that the media do have a responsibility. That where these kinds of unpleasant things are happening, that they're given proper coverage and that's communicated to the wider world what happens. And indeed, I noticed that Baroness Worsley has been saying in Georgetown, it was said in Georgetown in the middle of the month, that it was important that we get an international coalition against this, and that includes not just governments, but journalists and judges and all of the other people who, first of all, can bring to the notice of the world the abuses which are taking place, do something about it, and actually deal with those who are engaged in the particular abuses. It's already been mentioned today that there's many of these countries to which we give aid, and I don't take the argument that by denying aid to those countries we in some way disadvantage the people who live there. If that were the case, we would not impose sanctions anywhere, because of course there will always be people who are disadvantaged by sanctions. And if their aid is going, it's particularly easy if it's going to a government that is engaged and supporting these practices, to make it quite clear no further aid will be given. And if there are other channels by which, and perhaps some of our aid ought to be particularly targeted at those groups who are the persecuted groups, because, as has been said in the debate so far, sometimes it doesn't mean physical persecution. It means economic discrimination. It means educational discrimination. And maybe when we are thinking of how we spend our aid money, it should be targeted at those particular groups. We've already talked about the power of the Commonwealth and the ability there to put pressure on governments across the world, and which we have some influence on, where these abuses take place. I believe that this requires a concerted effort. I believe that it requires us to have the courage, and not to be politically correct, but to have the courage to say this is happening to a particular group of people. It will not be tolerated, and there will be things which this government will do. I've asked many questions about it. I've been told that the government has made people aware of, they've monitored, they're looking into, they're pressing. I think we want more than that when people's lives are at risk in the way in which they are.